At 3:47 a.m. Eastern Time, federal law enforcement officers entered the Oval Office of the White House to carry out one of the most consequential constitutional actions in American history: the enforcement of a Senate conviction removing a sitting president from office. According to officials familiar with the operation, 4 deputy U.S. marshals, accompanied by 3 Secret Service agents acting under the direction of Secret Service leadership and coordinated by an FBI supervisor, approached the resolute desk where the president was seated reviewing documents. The lead marshal identified himself and delivered the formal notice. The United States Senate had convicted and removed the president from office, and under the Constitution, that conviction was final. The officers informed him that he was no longer president and that they were there to facilitate his departure from the White House. What followed was the culmination of a 12-hour standoff that began shortly after the Senate vote the previous evening. At approximately 6:23 p.m., U.S. Marshals arrived at the White House carrying official documentation of the Senate's judgment, but were initially prevented from entering by members of the Presidential Protective Detail. The agents on duty faced an unprecedented dilemma: their obligation to protect the individual they had been assigned to safeguard versus their oath to uphold the Constitution. As tensions escalated, senior leadership intervened. By 8:47 p.m., the director of the Secret Service arrived at the White House and met directly with agents, emphasizing that their oath was to the Constitution and that once the Senate had exercised its constitutional authority to convict and remove, the office, not the individual, was the focal point of protection. Agents were informed that obstructing lawful enforcement could carry disciplinary and legal consequences. Over the next several hours, personnel shifts reflected a gradual alignment with that directive. By 9:34 p.m., several agents reassigned themselves to the protection detail of the incoming president. At 10:15 p.m., additional departures reduced the protective circle around the removed president. By midnight, only 7 agents remained inside with him, and internal deliberations continued. At 1:47 a.m., a final directive was issued: stand down and permit marshals to execute the Senate's order. At 2:34 a.m., the last holdouts complied. Shortly before 3 a.m., federal agencies finalized an operational plan designed to ensure a peaceful transition while authorizing necessary force if required. When officers entered at 3:47 a.m., they encountered the president along with 2 aides, a private attorney, and a political advisor. Those individuals were asked to leave the room and complied. The president was presented with a choice: depart voluntarily or be escorted. According to accounts from officials present, he objected to the legality of the removal and stated that he believed the Senate's conviction to be unconstitutional, asserting that he intended to challenge it in court. The lead marshal reiterated that the Senate's authority under Article 1 of the Constitution had been exercised and that enforcement was mandatory. After several minutes of discussion, the president stood, gathered personal items from his desk, and indicated that while he disagreed with the process, he would not resist physically. At 4:03 a.m., flanked by marshals, he exited the Oval Office, walked through the West Wing, and departed the White House grounds in a standard government SUV rather than a presidential aircraft or motorcade, marking the first time in 234 years that a president had been physically removed following a Senate conviction. 12 minutes later, at 4:15 a.m., the newly sworn-in president entered the White House and assumed control of the office, issuing an immediate directive to all federal departments, affirming the lawful chain of command and ordering the resumption of normal government operations. By 6:08 a.m., the first national security briefing under new leadership took place in the same Oval Office where the removal had occurred hours earlier, signaling continuity of governance despite the extraordinary circumstances. News of the overnight enforcement broke nationally and internationally by early morning, with networks interrupting regular programming to report that the Senate's conviction had been executed after initial resistance. Congressional leaders from both parties addressed the nation, stating that while the removal was unprecedented, the constitutional framework had functioned as designed. The Senate majority emphasized that conviction carries enforceable consequences, while the minority leader, who had voted to convict, affirmed that adherence to constitutional processes required acceptance of the outcome regardless of party affiliation. A statement released by the Chief Justice acknowledged that the Senate had acted within its constitutional authority to try impeachments, and that the enforcement of its judgment preserved the separation of powers. Meanwhile, the removed president's legal team issued a statement declaring the conviction invalid and announcing plans to pursue judicial review, raising complex questions about whether Senate impeachment verdicts are subject to court challenge or are considered final political judgments under the Constitution. Legal scholars across the country immediately began debating that issue, noting that while impeachment is explicitly assigned to Congress, the judiciary has historically refrained from intervening in the Senate's procedures. As Americans processed the events, historians pointed out that previous impeachments of presidents, Andrew Johnson in 1868, Bill Clinton in 1999, and two trials in the early 21st century, resulted in acquittals, leaving the removal power untested in practice until now. The overnight sequence established several immediate precedents: that a Senate conviction is not merely symbolic, that executive branch agencies will ultimately defer to constitutional determinations even amid internal disagreement, and that the physical occupancy of the White House is contingent upon lawful authority rather than personal assertion. Political analysts outline multiple potential paths forward. One scenario envisions institutional strengthening, with public acceptance of the outcome reinforcing the deterrent effect of impeachment. Another anticipates prolonged division, with competing narratives shaping voter attitudes and future elections. A third raises concerns about erosion of trust if large segments of the population reject the legitimacy of the process. Key indicators to watch include pending litigation, public opinion among partisan constituencies, the new administration's governance performance, internal cohesion within federal agencies and the military, potential legislative reforms clarifying removal procedures, and the emerging consensus among constitutional scholars. What remains indisputable is the timeline. Senate conviction in the evening, an hours-long standoff over enforcement, entry into the Oval Office at 3:47 a.m., departure at 4:03 a.m., assumption of office by the successor at 4:15 a.m., and restoration of routine executive functions by dawn. The episode demonstrated the practical mechanics of checks and balances under extreme strain. House impeachment, Senate trial, and conviction by a supermajority that included members of the president's own party, executive branch compliance with congressional authority, and immediate operational continuity under new leadership. For supporters of the removal, it stands as evidence that constitutional remedies remain viable, even in moments of profound political conflict. For critics, it raises questions about precedent, enforcement, and the balance between political judgment and democratic mandate. Courts may yet be asked to weigh procedural challenges, though the prevailing historical interpretation has treated impeachment as a political question reserved to Congress. As the country moves forward, the broader implications will unfold through elections, scholarship, public discourse, and the performance of the new administration. Regardless of perspective, the early morning transfer underscored a central constitutional principle. The presidency is an office defined by law, not a personal entitlement, and its tenure ultimately depends on adherence to the constitutional order. The immediate crisis has concluded, government operations continue, and the United States enters a new chapter shaped by an event that will be studied for generations as a defining test of institutional resilience, separation of powers, and the enforceability of the rule of law at the highest level of executive authority.